Society matters.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to hmTV. My name is Mireille Taub, and I'm delighted to be able to meet you and talk about your extraordinary grandmother. We're going to be talking about resistance and resilience. And I strongly believe, after having read her book and hearing so many survivor stories, that she was is an absolutely remarkable person. I'm going to introduce Dov Forman. He is a Holocaust educator, author, and digital storyteller, and the great-grandson of Holocaust survivor Lily Ebert, co-author of Lily's Promise. Dov's viral social media has reached millions of people on TikTok and other platforms with Lily's story of faith and survival and just general humanity. So impressive. Can you tell us about the story of Lily's Promise? Can you tell us how Lily's vow to tell her story, made while she was still in Auschwitz, we all know what that represents, inspired this book?
Of course. Well, firstly, thank you very much for having me on today. It's a pleasure to speak with you. My great-grandmother passed away in October, just a year ago, aged 100, when she had achieved so much. And as you say, her memoir was called Lily's Promise. And the reason we chose to call it Lily's Promise is because if I take you back all those years, when she was in Auschwitz in 1944, she made a promise to herself that if by a miracle she survived, she would tell the world her story. And that's exactly what she did in the final years of her life. She not only survived, but she thrived. She built a large and loving family of 10 grandchildren, 38 great grandchildren, one great great grandchild, 5 strong Jewish generations. And she ensured that over 1 billion people across the world learnt and heard from her story on TikTok, and tens of thousands of school children in the UK and also, again, across the world through social media and through Zoom calls like this one, and through podcasts and through news stories. And my great grandmother's story was always one of not only the darkest horrors of the hell that she experienced in Auschwitz, that many of us will be familiar with. It was also about how the Jewish people can rebuild from the ashes, and about how our love is always stronger than their hate. And I think that's what resonated with so many people, that not only did she educate about those horrors that she witnessed, together with her 2 sisters who survived with her through Auschwitz, in 4 months in that hell, and then 5 months in slave labor, and then the death march, but also about that twinkle of life in her eye and her smile, and how a survivor can rebuild and how they can hold on to hope. And those are all messages that we need so much more in the world today than ever.
I so strongly agree with you. I have trouble describing myself as a survivor. I was able to escape France in 1940, and the survival factor of family members, those who did and those who didn't, has become such an telling part of my life, literally telling as well as figuratively telling. I'd like you to address the power of storytelling. Not once upon a time there was a fairy tale kind of thing, but the power of telling the stories of truth and resilience. Can you do that?
Of course. Well, I think there's nothing more powerful than hearing the story of a survivor directly from them. And that's something that, unfortunately, as the survivors continue to dwindle and as we continue to move further on from the time of the Holocaust, will become more and more rare. And I think that's why it's so important now that we preserve these stories, whether that's through podcasts or in social media or through Spielberg's testimonies, etc. The list can go on, but it's so important that we hear directly from them, because Elie Wiesel, the Nobel laureate and Holocaust survivor, put it so powerfully and so correctly, which is that when you listen to a witness, you become a witness. When you listen to a survivor, you begin to internalize their story and to understand it, and to understand the depths of evil and where humanity can lead to. Because evil is a choice. The people that carried out the Holocaust were not monsters. They were evil, but they chose to be evil. They were not out of earth beings. They were doctors. They were people from some of the most civilized and educated societies in the world. And they chose to do this. And we've seen today how the world hasn't learnt, how the world hasn't become more tolerant, how the world hasn't understood where the dangers of unchecked and unchallenged hatred can lead to. And that's the places like Auschwitz-Birkenau. Because concentration camps, the death camps, the ghettos, they weren't contrived overnight. They didn't fall out of the sky. They were built up over years of intolerance, of difference, of people saying that the Jew is the other, and of people, ordinary bystanders, allowing that to happen and allowing that to get worse. And unfortunately, we're seeing those trends, those echoes, those shadows of history reappearing in the world today. And that's incredibly worrying. It was incredibly worrying to survivors like my great grandmother, and I'm sure to you too, and to people across the world, to see that the world hasn't learned. And that's why storytelling is so important. And that's why it's so important to preserve those stories. And for my great grandmother, it was important not only, however, to educate about those horrors, and not only to speak about tolerance. And one of the messages she always used to share on TikTok and elsewhere was that no matter what race, religion, ethnicity you are, when you cut us, it hurts, and we all bleed the same color red. So not only was it so important for her to share those stories and the stories of what she witnessed, the most harrowing things in Auschwitz, like babies being shot, thrown up in the air and shot at point blank range. And I think it's important that we share these stories so that the world doesn't forget. But she also wanted the world to learn about the power of hope, the power of humanity, and the power of humanity to rebuild. No matter how dark times are, she used to say, there's always light at the end of the tunnel. And it's those stories that resonated so much with people. And when I started with my great grandmother on TikTok, Holocaust educators and historians used to come to me and they used to say, I'm not sure that this is the right platform to educate about your great grandmother's story. And I said, you might be right, but look at how much anti Semitism there is there. Look at how much distortion and denial. We need to ensure that young children across the world are hearing the truth, are hearing from the survivors themselves, and are being educated about what really happened before they get sucked into the denial and the distortion. And that's why I think so many others have followed in our footsteps. And I'm incredibly proud of that because people realize how powerful and important it is that young people learn. The young people learn the stories of people like Lily Ebert, like my great grandmother, and like the tens of thousands of survivors who are still alive and still able to speak about their harrowing testimonies. And it's so important that the younger Jewish generation and people all across the world, not just Jews, take on these stories. And again, ensure that when we say never forget, never again, we actually mean it.
I think there are two parallel themes in what you've been saying. And one of them is the great fear of our losing our humanity and becoming mechanical creatures of motion and just existence. But there are several quotes from the book that profoundly affected me. So one of them, following that theme, is just having one person cared restores my faith in humanity. And that really was possibly a driving force in your grandmother's desire, more than desire, determination to live. So that it really resonated with me.
I couldn't agree more. And as you say, it's just about one person. And I think my great grandmother saw that throughout her life, whether that was one person who showed her kindness after the death march, the American soldier who gave her a note on a German banknote where he said and wrote 10 words of hope, the start to a new life, good luck and happiness. Whether it was that first kind of piece of kindness and that first person who cared and showed her that humanity can be restored after the hell of the Holocaust. And she kept on to that note for 76 years. And I eventually found it in the back of her cupboard and posted it on Twitter. And that's when my journey with my great grandmother started on social media, because we managed to find that soldier within 24 hours. Or whether it was the people in the Holocaust Survivor Centre in the UK, showing that there are psychologists who are able to help and who care and who want to help restore her humanity. Or whether it was her showing her sisters that she cared about them and that she wanted to look after them in the camps. And I think there's so much in Lily's promise in my great grandmother's story, and the stories of all of the survivors, of pieces that we can learn from. And if people often say to me, what's the most important lesson you learned from my great grandmother? Well, the truth is I could sit here all day to teach the lessons, whether it's about family, the importance of never giving up hope, the importance of staying tolerant, the importance of challenging hatred, the importance of standing up for others. There's hundreds of messages I could sit here and tell you about. But again, one of those is just showing that you care, showing that you care for another person, and showing that we care for humanity.
I totally agree. I'm so sorry that I didn't have the opportunity to meet her, but she sounds like the most remarkable person. There was another quote that I fixated on, if that's the right word. It wasn't the nutrition of the stolen food that made me feel better. It was defiance. with your soul fed by a small act of resistance, even if it made no difference to anyone else, it was important. The fact that she could stand up and say, look at what we are doing, look at us. Just extraordinarily impressive.
My great grandmother always says, and I think there was this myth, especially in Israel after the Holocaust, that the Jews didn't resist. And I mean, just besides the fact that it would be impossible for them to do so in Auschwitz, even though there were attempts to, each survivor has their own form of resistance. Each person had their own personal resistance in the way. And for my great grandmother, that was a few things. One was just being and living and with her two sisters, still being proud to be Jewish and fasting on Auschwitz, fasting in Auschwitz on Yom Kippur, for example. Those were small personal acts of resistance. And also, my great grandmother managed to carry through a golden necklace, which she was given on her fifth birthday as a present from her mother. That was the only golden piece of jewelry which survived Auschwitz with its original owner. My great grandmother wore that necklace proudly every single day after her survival for the rest of her life until she passed away last October, aged 100. But again, it was those small pieces of resistance that helped her get through it. And again, I think Jews across the world today, in an ever more polarized, darker world for Jews, we can take inspiration from that. That even in those hellish times and periods of the worst hell on earth in Auschwitz, the survivors were able to find their own personal small pieces of resistance. And I think today we can do that too. And we can stand up and we can be proud to be Jews because that's ultimately the lesson that I learned from my great grandmother that even in that place, she was able to show that her faith in humanity and her hope would prevail over the evil Nazis. And I think that's what we have to say today against these anti Semites who, again, want to destroy us.
Well, I don't remember, and I'm sorry that I don't remember the name of the author who talked about choiceless choices in that time period. And when we talk about resistance, we talk about passive resistance, the desire to stay alive from one moment to another, from 1 hour to another, from one day to another, spiritual resistance, active resistance, which is the last act of resistance. And it's just your grandmother embodies every definition of resistance that has been called up to terms.
People wonder why we have Yom HaShoah, which is in April, which is the Jewish Day of Remembrance for the Holocaust, and then we have in January the International Day for Holocaust Remembrance. And the answer is, I mean, there are a few reasons, but one of them, the simple answer, is that the International Day commemorates the worst hell and commemorates all of the essentially the worst things that happened in the Holocaust, as we do too on Yom HaShoah, the Jewish Day of Remembrance. But the Yom HaShoah, the Jewish Day of Remembrance, commemorates also the resistance and the Jewish uprising, particularly around the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and that's why it's marked on that date. And again, it's to show that we didn't go like lambs to the slaughter, as was the myth after the Holocaust. We are a people who did resist in our own way, and some people may have gone through active resistance, joining the partisans, but others resisted in their own small personal defiances. And I think that is important to note.
We will not go quietly into the night, as the famous poet said. There's another expression another sense of words that I've taken from the book. She says, the one thing we must remember is that we must remember. We must tell the world. We must not let the world forget. We must continue to tell children and our children's children. I'd like to hear why you believe this is so critical in our understanding of the times then and the times now.
My great grandmother believed more than anything in education in the world. And I think after October 7th, she was so distraught to see the age old tropes, the anti Semitism which she thought had died with the liberation of Auschwitz, revive. And I think that was the sad truth for her and other survivors that, again, she so believed that the world needed to remember, and never to forget, and needed to keep speaking out. And she felt that that promise of never again, that the promise that we were going to speak out, the promise that we were going to educate, our children and their children and the whole of society not to hate Jews for no reason. I think she felt that that was completely let down and that that promise had completely faltered. And it was very, very difficult for her to realize that and to see that in the world and to see her own grandchildren and great grandchildren go through anti Semitism at university, on college campuses, in schools, on the streets, to see her great grandson who wears a kippah be shouted at for no other reason than he's Jewish on the streets, things that she remembered from her childhood and from her teenage years in Eastern Europe. And again, I think my great grandmother believed more than anything. She did this, after all, for decades, educating. She wanted people to learn. She believed that the only way for people to learn was to hear from the survivors. And that's why we ended up writing the book, so that we could make sure that it was there for posterity, so that people could pull it off their shelves in hundreds of years' time and say, this was Lily Ebert's story. This was the story of someone who was there, the true story from her lips onto paper, so that people can learn.
I understand completely. I've recently published a book of my family stories, and when I tell people about it, I try to suggest, well, it's more important than that. I do suggest that we tell these stories that connect the past to the present and into the future, because that's what keeps us going, who we are and what we want the world to be like, a better place than some of the horrific things that have occurred. Your grandmother was one of the most remarkable people I've come across, both in real life, of course, and in print. What she did as an older person, where very often we're assumed to be somewhat invisible or negligible, her whole attitude in putting information together and working with senior clubs was so moving and so powerful. You must have been so proud of her.
Totally. I mean, her passing leaves a massive void, not only for me as her great grandson and someone who spent almost every day with her for the last few years educating together, but also for the whole family and for much of the Jewish community in London, and again, people across the world who followed her story so closely. She was so incredible. And she always wanted to do more, even in her final years. She always wanted to reach more people. She would always say to me, let's do something, Dov. And then I would say, we've done something, Safta. Look how much you've achieved. You've got 2 million followers on TikTok. Your book has sold hundreds of thousands of copies. People all around the world know who you are and have heard your story. And she would say, no, we need to do something more. We need to find a new way to reach the young people. And again, back to your previous question, she was so concerned about educating young people, particularly young people, because she knew that the only way to infiltrate the minds is in a young age, before the anti-Semites, before the Holocaust deniers and distorters do on social media. And also the only way to really impress the importance of it, again, is at such a young age, to hear these stories and to understand where hatred, if left unchecked and unchallenged, and in the way that it was then and in the way that it is now again today, where that can lead. And she really was such an inspiration in teaching me how to never give up, how to keep going, and how to always strive for more. She was never satisfied with how much she had done. She always wanted more. And I think it's such an incredible lesson for so many of us.
I see her standing behind your shoulder. as an as a retired educator, and I've done this through the museum many times. My personal question is as to what age one begins to discuss this. How graphic is the imagery we share? When I was teaching at one point in a third grade classroom, the children had been discussing the Holocaust, which I thought was quite young. But because I was there in person, I could tell them my personal experience, my family experience. And I've noticed that there are a number of picture books, a great way of telling a story to very young children. How did your grandmother feel about the appropriate age to discuss man's inhumanity to man?
A very good question, and one which we discussed a lot and she grappled with, and I'm still trying to grapple with as a very young educator. Not from my personal experience because I wasn't there, but from the experience of my great grandmother and other survivors which I speak to. I think it depends, and it depends on the way you're going to do it and what you're going to teach them. Of course, the most graphic stories should not be taught to someone who's in third grade or of that age, but personal stories, the stories of where hatred can lead to, the stories of perhaps the surface level of what the Holocaust was, and that there were people, again, on a very basic level, there were people called the Nazis who tried to kill the Jews. I think there are things like that that young people can understand and that we must impress on them. Again, whether it's at the age of third grade or fifth grade, I don't know. The teachers will be able to tell us what the most appropriate age is. But certainly this needs to be tailored in the right way. And we did that on social media too. We were very conscious that people of all ages can have very easy access to the videos that we were publishing and putting out. And so we made sure that we were putting some videos which were much lighter and not as in graphic detail. There were some which were graphic, but we would have a warning on them. And we really made tried to make it as accessible as possible. My great grandmother grappled with this question a lot, but ultimately there are ways to do it. There are books. When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit, for example, is one that they often introduce to younger, maybe early secondary school pupils, and Anne Frank's diary, etc. These are things which are obviously more appropriate to younger students, and then you have more graphic books, which and there are picture books, of course, too, and then there are more graphic books for when you get a bit older. But I think ultimately this was the darkest period in human history, and we need to make sure that it remains unique and sacrosanct in human history, and that we actually do teach it to young children in the right way.
Well, I think that perhaps some of the effective ways of teaching stories of this kind is to focus on those upstanders who went out of their way to protect the victims of oppression. And the anti-bullying message is a very powerful message with very young children. Other personal memoirs appealing to what we call middle school students are equally effective, because that particular age looks around and says, who am I? What am I going to be? What is my past? And so they can relate to very specific things. I read Anne Frank probably about the time I was 13, and I was one of those questioning kids. I was too young to remember why, how we came to the States, but I'd always ask, tell me a story, Daddy. Tell me a story, Mom. Tell me what was going on, so that I knew about this even as a relatively young kid. So although I think third grade is still probably a little bit young, anti-bullying stories are very effective for teaching appropriate behavior. The other stories fall in at a later point in life, of course. But it's a tough teach, having been in the classroom for so many years. Definitely a tough teach.
I don't envy the job of having to teach it, having done talks myself. But it's so important, and I also think we underestimate how much kids know, especially in the social media age, and how much access to this information they do have. And so again, I think it's important that we make sure to engage in this, even if in a certain message like the anti-bullying way. We need to make sure that we're engaging with young people across the world at this from a young age, because ultimately, who knows what they're seeing online.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I found very interesting, because even as a very young child, or perhaps I was always a comic book fan. So when we talk about the early comic books in America, where we have Superman and Wonder Woman and various characters taking on the role of the defender of democracy and human rights, that's a graphic image that is very appropriate to young children. It's not just the crime fighting, it's an attitude towards life. And your grandmother had an extraordinary attitude.
Exactly. And I think, again, that's what we tried to portray to people on social media. And again, people who met her in person could see this immediately. And I think that's why people ask, why did you have so much success? There are a number of reasons. One, we were the first people educating about the Holocaust this way online. But number two is my great grandmother had such a zest for life. Everyone loved her smile, everyone loved her attitudes. And who can't help but fall in love with such a person and want to follow them and want to follow their story and learn more, and learn how someone who went through the darkest hell on earth and saw their mother, youngest sister, and youngest brother being murdered in Auschwitz and the gas chambers, and losing her father at a young age, and going through this terrible hell, and then coming out in this way. Who can't help but admire and want to learn more about this person and understand how they've done that, and how they survived, and how they've rebuilt, and how they've been able to live their life in such a way. And so I think that's one of the reasons, one of the many, several reasons why we might have had this, again, success in inverting commas. But she really carried out her life in the most incredible way, and it's an example for us all. And I
Yeah.
think is also an inspiration for people who are going through difficult times throughout the whole world. Everyone has challenges and difficulties throughout their life at some periods. But ultimately, my great grandmother's story shows that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and that you can get through this and you can continue to live a happy and proud life.
I have a visual image of your grandmother flying around with a big Superwoman emblem on her chest and a flowing cape, flying around the room and leaving her message for all of us to learn by. But I'm so proud to have read her book and so proud to have met you. And I cannot begin to thank you for sharing her story with all of us. It will leave a wonderful impression with everyone who reads it.
Oh, thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Dov.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
And hope to meet you in real time.
Likewise, I will let you know if I'm ever across the pond on your side.
Right.
Right.
Stay well.
And thank you again for everything that you've done for your grandmother and for all of us
No,
sharing the
thank you. I
story.
appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.